Okay, and thank you everyone for coming along. I think from the Minister this morning and also from Michael, the other Michael, the first Michael, we've had the chance to really sort of set the scene both in sort of a state and a national and also in an international context for our discussions today. So my job over the next half an hour is to talk you through the report that you would have been handed when you came in the room today. So the less to lose, more to gain report is the outcome of the last sort of year or 18 months of work that Moira Gear and I have been doing, funded by the New South Wales Government, to advance the implementation of their domestic violence reforms and also to complement the national plan as well. So today, what I'd like to do in particular is to look at some of the reflections that we've heard as we went around the country and interviewed stakeholders in this field. It's really clear from our experience that practice is really driving this field forward. Michael's already mentioned the sheer weight of global reviews of evidence and evaluations and so on and so on. And it's really common in health and welfare fields that have got this, complex social interventions aiming to change these wicked problems that we've been stuck on for a very long time. It's common that we have these mixed evaluations and particularly because evaluations tend to be focused on, discrete program components. What do we need to do? How many sessions? What should be in our sessions? What's the kind of facilitation we should have, and so on, in order to deliver success. And of course, these are all really important parts of program development. But underlying these components are some really important background contextual factors that the stakeholders that we spoke to said, they need to be in place if we're going to be successful in achieving the goal of primary prevention. And of course, engaging boys and men is a strategy that we use to facilitate that overall goal. So very briefly, these were the four sort of study questions that we were tasked to address by the New South Wales Government. So the first was to evaluate the effectiveness of existing approaches, strategies and projects that aim to prevent violent behaviour, particularly violence against women. To identify the characteristics of good practice in men and boys primary prevention and early intervention. And we were also asked to identify strategies and programs that can be developed to build on good practice and what are the kinds of exemplar or demonstration projects that we can implement in New South Wales to advance practice. So the study sort of ran over four key stages. So we undertook a critical sort of overview and analysis of the existing evidence in relation to the social determinants of violence against women. And so this was certainly a global overview from our point of view, but also a strong focus on what we have here in Australia. We've also identified the range of different sort of promising programs and best practice. And there's a core component of the report at your table that's drawing all of that evidence together. So I certainly hope that you find it a useful summary. So we then embarked on a national consultation with stakeholders in the field of violence prevention. So initially we began by pulling together an online survey that we distributed through a range of different networks, really asking people to identify whether they were doing primary prevention work, what they understood primary prevention to mean, how long they've been doing that work and the kind of work that they were doing in primary prevention. And we also, from this survey and also through other means, identified and began undertaking interviews and focus groups with stakeholders. So that's really going to be the focus of my discussion with you today. So it's a 250-page report. I'm not going to try and summarise it in 20 minutes, but I do want to look at what stakeholders were telling us is really emerging for them as the important success factors in engaging men and boys. Stage 3 involved the identification of best practice or exemplar programs, and we're really lucky today to have representatives from those 2 programs that we are showcasing in the report here. So after morning tea, they're going to be presenting their work and also engaging in a bit of Q&A with some discussants and also taking some questions from you. So what really emerged for us as we were engaged in this review is the importance of whole of community and whole of organisation strategies. So these are approaches that do have direct participation aspects to them, and they're really sort of grounded in a focus on workshops and education, changing norms and attitudes and so on. But that direct participation work is embedded within a much larger program of environmental intervention with an aim of strengthening communities, strengthening organisations, and making sure that the program is really feeding into those communities and organisations and helping them to achieve a better culture, a stronger structure, more cohesive, more coherent to support behaviour change. So very quickly, we undertook 26 interviews and also 2 focus groups involving 37 stakeholders. Most of our participants were from Victoria. That's no surprise. It's really been in Victoria that we've seen violence prevention work, really being driven. We also undertook work with stakeholders in New South Wales and one from the Northern Territory. We had some interest from other states and a number of services that work primarily with perpetrators did identify their work in terms of prevention. So the Minister spoke this morning about the importance of reducing recidivism and sort of the burden of recidivist offenders in the overall burden of violent incidents. But certainly our task in this project was to focus specifically on primary prevention that intervenes before violent incidents. So interviews were conducted really broadly with people who were developing violence prevention programs, people who were delivering them, facilitating them, educators, managers of those programs. We also spoke to people who are working in the public service, and in public policy on violence prevention, and also because we're academics, we couldn't help interviewing a few academics as well. So a range of programs and activities represented, so addressing really diverse subpopulations, people working in Indigenous communities, culturally and linguistically diverse communities, gay and lesbian communities, migrant, refugee communities, and so on. But we also took in a range of work in different settings, so community-based work, work that's taking place in victim support agencies, and a number of domestic violence and sexual assault services have been doing prevention and outreach work for a long time, schools-based work, university-based work, and so on. So really some of the core themes that emerged for us and that the stakeholders sort of raised with us are summarised here. And what I'd like to do is go through these 5 points and just really start to pull out some quotes from stakeholders that really sort of brought these to life for us. In terms of our presentation of the interview material in the report, we've identified, I suppose, 2 sort of core areas. So firstly, stakeholders' reflections on best practice in violence prevention generally. So they had a lot to say about how you gauge, community and institutional readiness in violence prevention. So rather than just assume that every institution, every community is ready for a prevention program, acknowledging that prevention work is intensive, it actually demands quite a lot of people to sit back and start to reflect on their community, their institution, start to change what they do. And that might not be a priority for that community or that institution at that time. We had a stakeholder, for example, working with quite a recent small migrant community that's got quite a short history here in Australia. And what he said to us is, at this point, primary prevention's not their core focus. They're trying to find a job, they're trying to find housing. So sometimes it's really a matter of, waiting for the right time and even doing work to kind of build readiness for prevention rather than assuming that we can just leap in. And then that sort of consultation and that collaboration work, and there was some really, really inspiring services and practitioners taking some time to work with communities, identifying, what are the priorities for these communities, what are the drivers for violence against women from the point of view of these communities. And that involved identifying the leaders in those communities, and involved working with key figures in those communities and institutions as well. And sometimes offsetting that work with some of the cautionary points that Michael raised, which means, engaging not only with male leaders or male key figures in that community, but making sure that work's going on to speak to women who are also prominent in those communities and not reinforcing gendered power structures and imbalances. Communities and institutions are often in touch with a range of different services, a number of different stakeholders, and it was important, stakeholders told us, to be in contact with people who are already connected with those contexts. And last but not least, we've discussed a range of kind of pedagogical strategies in the document that are sort of well rehearsed in the literature already, but something that was a really consistent message for us from stakeholders was about the ongoing challenge of sustainable funding, and particularly funding for evaluation. So the demand from funders that services provide them with gold standard evaluation, and yet that requires money, and that money isn't coming from funders. So a sort of a vicious circle where there's not the money to do the kind of evaluation that you want to do, and funders are saying, until you have that evaluation data, we're not going to fund you. So just around these core issues on engaging boys and men, what I want to do is really just raise, I suppose, some of these issues that stakeholders brought to our attention. I'm not necessarily going to have the answers to some of these questions, and I'm really hoping that it will feed into your thinking and also your discussions a bit later on today. So stakeholders were really clear about the importance of talking with boys and men about the links between masculinity and violence, and they saw this as really essential to any primary prevention program. But they emphasised that it's really a fraught area. Prevention messaging can sometimes reinforce the very stereotypes it aims to challenge. So it was really important then for programs to move beyond sort of a one-dimensional or a one-size-fits-all account of masculinity. So there's a few people in the room that are going to recognise their own words up on the screen, but I'm going to maintain their anonymity for the moment. So one particular prevention facilitator and researcher, she said in her work with sports clubs, she said, we had an understanding of gender that was not purely about hegemonic masculinity, but was about the ways that masculinities might run in parallel within a particular person. So one of the guys was a really tough player, fearsome player in the day. I remember watching him. He was just hardcore. Extraordinarily gentle guy off the field and really articulate about the way he played and why he played like he did. People aren't just one aspect of their gender. So recognising the multiplicity of masculinities between men and boys, but also within men and boys, requires an appreciation of the diversity of their experiences. And what is coming up in prevention work is just the many different ways that men and boys are impacted by violence, in the schoolyard, at home, in their peer groups, on the street, where there's often, a constant awareness of the potential for violence, as well as the fact that men and boys may well have experienced, physical or sexual assault in the family, and also witnessed physical and sexual assault as well. So this brought up some really key issues around the ethics of doing this work and the need for sensitivity in engaging men and boys in discussions around gender and violence. So a program facilitator said, I think the ethics of education are really interesting because you are messing with people, especially around this stuff. It's very fundamental identity stuff. There were also victims and survivors of sexual assault in the groups too. People from families with lots of trauma, lots of people disclosed to us and or told us stories of friends and sisters and so on who had experienced violence. What that was like for them or their mothers, or, there was no sense that it did not resonate for them. So men and boys, we can see then, have this, real diversity of exposure to violence, and they understand the links between violence and gender in a range of different ways. And so it was important that masculinity was named in prevention, but also that it was negotiated in a complex way. So a significant proportion, and probably the majority of the programs that we that we sort of evaluated as part of the study are working in disadvantaged communities, so low-income communities, Indigenous or ethnic minority communities where there's just not a lot of money, not a lot of resources, not a lot of government investment. So it then became a real challenge to talk to men and boys about male power when power wasn't necessarily something that they were experiencing in their day-to-day life. So there could then emerge a kind of a disconnect between the theorisation of violence as an expression of male power and then men's experience of violence, often in the context of powerlessness. So we had one sort of research and policy expert, and she noted that, this conversation about male power didn't always really connect with men and boys. She said the challenge with that too is that there are men and boys who are disenfranchised, for whom power is not an experience they actually have, unless it's maybe lording it over somebody else. But in the grand scheme of things, they're actually profoundly disenfranchised. So another stakeholder was working in refugee communities, and she really emphasised the fragility of masculinity and masculine authority in the turmoil of migration and resettlement. So sometimes prevention programs were heard by the men as asking them to give up sort of a traditional sense of entitlement to male authority when already they felt like they were sacrificing so much as part of the migration and the refugee experience. So she said the first thing they see is that they've got to give up something, and they've got to give up a lot. They're already unemployed, they can't find work, and their role in the family has been trashed in their way of thinking, and then you want me to give up this. So experts really emphasise the intersectional issues of race, class and social status, as well as gender, and the importance of negotiating this in programs that engage with men and boys. So one school-based coordinator was working in really low-income schools, and she said that's constantly at the forefront of our minds, that these young people walk around carrying a lot of shame already. So how do we correct this or support them to challenge that thinking without actually shaming them? So I think that's really an open and an ongoing question. So how then do we frame prevention for boys and men? We had one stakeholder who was working in a university context, and initially his work, he set up prevention programs at a university, and he marketed it as, it's men's responsibility to stop violence against women. It's your responsibility to get into my room and put your bum on this seat and go through this workshop. And unsurprisingly, he didn't get a lot of buy-in for a year and a half. The program was just failing because the message that men and boys have the responsibility to prevent violence against women might be a strong moral principle. It might be one we can really adhere to, but is it the best way of getting men and boys to engage with prevention and prevention programs? He also argued that this notion that men and boys must do this or have a responsibility to do this potentially actually reinforced problematic kinds of authoritarian power relations. It was actually an ultra kind of masculinity that was becoming embedded in programs in a punitive way. So rather than focusing on male responsibility to prevent violence against women in sort of an abstract sense, stakeholders recommended situating this responsibility within the social and the family roles of boys and men as managers, leaders, elders, fathers, husbands, boyfriends, sons, and so on and so on. So this approach frames violence against women as an obstacle to the kind of life that boys and men want to lead, the kind of community they want to live in, or the kind of institution that they want to be a part of. And so stakeholders said this prompted a much more constructive and active engagement from men and boys. So one community-based educator said that he began his workshops, and again he might recognise his words in the room, what kind of father do you want to be? What kind of father? What kind of husband? What kind of man do you want to be? Now, I've sat in on sessions where those questions have been asked in the introduction to the program. These are things that we're going to be exploring, and instantly the men will hear that it's recognisable. I've seen the hardest, most brutal-looking men reduced to tears in that very moment, because everybody, I think, wants to be good. So this active reframing of prevention in terms of the aspirations and the life goals of men and boys can reposition them as partners in prevention rather than clients or participants. So we heard very strongly from practitioners around the importance of a peer-to-peer approach. So of course this had risks because potentially participants in these programs or male leaders of change in these programs may begin to promulgate misogynist or sexist views. So we had a couple of stakeholders calling this the dickhead moment, when somebody sort of speaks up in the middle of a workshop with the dickhead comment. But importantly, what facilitators said to us, they said, resistance to the program doesn't have to be a bad thing. You can use resistance to actually open up dialogue and open up a more constructive engagement. So a school-based facilitator, he said, when you have the peer-led approach, where they say something that is not consistent with our program, usually their peers actually respond the right way. So the facilitator says, so what do you think about what Johnny said, like saying that so-and-so is a slut for doing that? And usually their peers will come up with an alternative response like, yeah, no, that's not cool. So instead of being authoritative and telling them what's the right or wrong answer, the peer-led approach is just engaging discussion, getting them to come up with the answers and drawing out responses from them, which is 9 out of 10 times it works like that. So really importantly in this peer-to-peer approach, and this was, I think, a really interesting comment, it really stuck out for me, the peer-led model should not just reproduce existing hierarchies of male authority, but it can actually expose boys and men to the diversity of masculinity and the diversity of gender relations that are already evident in their peer group. So in fact, older men and leaders actually have a lot to learn from younger men and boys in their care. So in the context of a sports club, she said in many cases the young men might be engaging, for example, with their female partners in a much more egalitarian way than the coaches or the CEOs are. Or they might have many more women friends than the older men have. The older men might be socialising in all male groups, whereas the young guys have always had a mixed friendship group. But the older men can't necessarily see that the younger men have, in fact, a very different approach to gender than they do. So the peer-led approach potentially making different kinds of masculinity much more visible. So the other, Michael raised this issue around accountability, and we had one, or more than a couple quite experienced sort of service managers and policy experts sounding a really strong note of caution in relation to the role of men and boys in primary prevention. So this particular service manager was visiting a range of communities in which men's groups and services were already operating, and she was told by the women in the community that the blokes who are actually running the programs are domestic violence and sexual assault offenders, and that if behaviours like violence against women and kids come up in the men's programs, it's absolutely excused. So this really foregrounds the important issue of accountability of men in primary prevention, both to women and also to the communities and the institutions that they are working within. So we had a number of services that already had these accountability measures sort of built in. A number of programs were hosted and part of domestic violence and sexual assault services that had a long history of feminist work in this area. And other programs were developed within non-government organisations with a good, solid background in welfare and therapeutic service delivery. So this ensured that program activities were informed by by the experience of these organisations in the really complex dynamics of trauma and abuse. And it also meant that work with boys and men was being complemented and occurring alongside work with girls and women. We also had a number of services and organisations that had these sort of feedback mechanisms where they were reporting back to community and institutional representatives through formal advisory committees or through community forums. We did come across a small group or cluster of so-called prevention efforts that were clearly disconnected from services, clearly disconnected from best practice in the area. So we had one, he called himself a male health promotion consultant, claiming that the reason why it's difficult to engage boys and men in violence prevention is because boys and men face widespread anti-male discrimination. And he went on, for example, to describe services for victimised women as a domestic violence industry. He suggested that the scale of male perpetration of violence was exaggerated and that the reason for male perpetration was violent television and video games. So these are the responses that illustrate the real importance that programs that are being funded and supported are drawing upon established expertise in the field of domestic violence and sexual assault, and they are and should be accountable to communities and to women. So just to draw all of these sort of thoughts together, stakeholders made a number of suggestions around improving the engagement of boys and men in primary prevention. They emphasised the complexity of masculinity in the lives of boys and men, and particularly its intersections with race, class, sexuality and disadvantage, as well as men and boys in a very diverse lived experiences of violence. So effective engagement with boys and men required a tailored approach that aimed to establish the relevance of the program to the lives and the aspirations of the men and boys that it was reaching out to. So there was a real emphasis by stakeholders on engaging sort of, the range of organisations and services already in this area, to build collaborative links, and also to maintain an ongoing and really productive dialogue between the men and boys programs and the more established sort of victim support and treatment approaches. I'll leave it there, thank you.